Okay, so just a little bit about me. I was just talking there and saying, I've had a bit of a varied background, but I've been working at the Cooperative College. I initially came to the college to work in research and projects, and like with a lot of small charities, you end up kind of doing multiple jobs. So now I'm mainly working on developing curriculum and teaching. And just to sort of say a few things about the Cooperative College, it's a small educational charity based in Manchester in Holyoke House. And it's been up and running for over 100 years. And it was set up by the cooperative movement in the UK to sort of recognize the fact that there was no education being provided for cooperators, because to work together cooperatively, it requires a kind of different skill set to what people would learn about regular businesses. And it wasn't just about teaching people how to work in cooperatives. It was teaching people about, cooperative behaviors and cooperative skills, and, the cooperative character as well. So the college, like from the outset, cooperatives provided reading rooms and newspapers and kind of access to education that people would never have had, because those kind of things like libraries and things, they didn't even exist for the general public to access. So it was really, really important that the cooperative movement provided this for cooperative members. So just to say a few things about what I'm going to be talking about, thinking about cooperatives, they've had an interesting history, and sort of they exist in most countries around the world. And nowadays, people might think of them as being a bit of a relic, but it's really important to remember how radical they were when they were first set up, but also, how we can apply them in today's context, and how cooperatives have kind of changed through time and have constantly adapted to the circumstances. So thinking about, how can we use cooperation in today's world to sort of combat current issues. So we'll be looking at all of that kind of thing. But the way that I want to structure today is to, talk through some slides and then give you some time to have some conversations together. So I'll be kind of posing some questions, but they're not very challenging. They're just really a sort of conversation starter. And then what we'll do is we'll just have some feedback from people in the room, and then we'll move on to the next section. So to kick us off, we're going to look a little bit on cooperatives past. So, how did cooperatives come about? And I always like this quote because, in today's world, capitalism seems to be the dominant force. And it's really important to remember that, people have always cooperated throughout time. And, actually people cooperating together for economic and social purposes, it predates neoliberal capitalism, by centuries. So I always think that, the idea of, competing with people is actually much newer concept than cooperation, which people needed to do to survive. So just to kind of give a few examples of this, starting off with African American economic organizing in the US, there's been quite a lot of research that's come around recently, which talks about how people would set up economic mutuals. So people would pool their resources, and it would enable people to fund activities such as paying for funerals or paying for medical costs, but it also enabled people to pool their resources and even buy their freedom, so that people who were enslaved were able to pool money. And it was often the only way that people had in order to, to kind of create savings and access credit as well. So that was a really important example. Another example is a cooperative that was set up in the 18th century Greece. And that was set up for people who were growing yarn, different crops to make yarn. And it was the first sort of example of what we would call nowadays a multi-stakeholder cooperative, because it was for people who were producing, it was for people who were growing, and it was also for people who were selling and marketing the product. And then another really good example, and this dates back to the 14th century, is people transporting goods across the Sahara. So all the way across North Africa, people cooperatively owned the camels that were used for the camel trains that went from West Africa all the way up to Egypt. So that's another example. And then this is another interesting one, which is the Decembrists in Siberia. So this is in the 1800s. And at that point, a group of prisoners were sent to Siberia because the Tsar, they'd tried to stage an uprising against the Tsar at that time. And they set up an organization called the Great Artel, which was effectively a cooperative. And they even had like a committee of people who ran that cooperative. And they would use it to pool resources. So when they were sent anything from their families, they would pool those resources, but they also grew crops and did other jobs as well. And they were able to then make money from people living around the prisoner camp as well. And this one also dates from the 14th century in India. So people would pool resources to manage collective access to water. So they would create the FAD, which was a type of like water saving tank. And people would, because obviously, you know, the rain would only come very seasonally. And so they needed to manage that water to make it last and share it evenly amongst the community. But they also used it to kind of work together and also to market their goods collectively. So it was about managing resources, but it was also about, you know, getting a better deal for themselves in terms of their selling and buying activities, which kind of reflects producer cooperatives today as well. And then finally, we've got an example of savings and credit cooperatives. So throughout time, I mean, this one is an example from Japan, and it's the Mujin, they were called. And they were used by people, and these were people often who were enslaved as well. So it was their kind of access to being able to, you know, have savings and credit. But there's loads and loads of examples throughout history of these types of like very local community savings and credit cooperatives as well. So that's just a kind of handful of examples to show that, you know, cooperatives aren't new. They weren't invented by the Rochdale pioneers in the 1800s, despite the fact that if you go to Rochdale, you have to go under a bridge that says the home of cooperation. So thinking about when did cooperation become cooperatives? So, you know, we've seen the examples of, you know, all of those different people working through, you know, throughout history together. And, you know, often in quite formal ways as well. So it wasn't just, you know, a kind of a random selection of people, you know, they were actually quite formal as well. But looking at the situation of what was happening in the UK at the time of the Rochdale pioneers or immediately prior to the Rochdale pioneers, you know, there was lots and lots of changes in laws. So, for example, there was the poor law, which meant that if people were destitute, they had to go into a workhouse, which in theory was supposed to kind of support poorer people and mean that they had somewhere to live, but it often meant that they were actually really exploited and people got, you know, families got separated, and many workhouses were just absolutely horrific for people. So people, you know, there were riots against workhouses. There was a lot of people coming into the cities, and the Industrial Revolution meant that a lot of skilled laborers lost their jobs and then had to work in factories where they weren't being recognized for the skills that they had. So we've got an example there of the Luddites who would sabotage machinery. And then there was the Corn Laws as well, which meant that, you know, people couldn't access a lot of food at that point because they brought in laws to restrict imports of corn. And then there were failed harvests in the UK, so it meant that a lot of people went hungry. So there was a lot of agitation and also political agitation as well. We had, you know, the Chartists, and there was the Peterloo massacre. And then there was a lot of issues in mainland Europe as well, because there was the sort of the tail end of the Napoleonic Wars. So there was a lot of going on at that point. So people started to organize themselves and organizing themselves into collective types of organizations. So now looking at the types of cooperatives that were coming about in the UK prior to the Rochdale Pioneers. So a few examples here. We've got the Fenwick Weavers in 1761, and they were a group of people who organized themselves so that they could get a better price for their products and so that they could safeguard their skills. And then this is supposed to be the oldest consumer cooperative that was set up in the UK, is the Oldham Cooperative Supply Company. Now, unfortunately, there's not any records of what it actually did in practice. There's these sort of articles of association, but it doesn't actually there's not much kind of contextual evidence, unfortunately. So I can't really sort of tell you much more about their activities. And another sort of important one was the Anti-Mill Industrial Society, because at that point, millers would charge a premium for producers to mill their grains and sell them on. So they effectively got together and organized themselves to take out the middleman and keep the profits for themselves. And then another couple of examples. So we've got the Sheerness Cooperative Society. Now, if you go to a website, there's quite an interesting website about that one, and it talks about the Rochdale Pioneers and says, they're not the real pioneers. We're the real pioneers. So I find that quite interesting. But they set up very similarly to the Rochdale Pioneers. They set up to provide the basics for themselves. So it was about kind of protecting themselves from price hikes, and also for poor quality food and products. And also people were often paid in kind, or paid so that they had to buy products from certain suppliers. And then, so they were being exploited at work, and then they were being further exploited by being paid in kind and having to spend their earnings in shops that were also kind of owned by the mills and things. So it was really really difficult for people. And then this final one, I've never been able to find any evidence, and one day I probably will have to go to some archive somewhere and find some evidence. But this London Cooperative Society was set up, but it was kind of like a theoretical cooperative society that was set up by a lot of people who were talking about cooperatives at that point. So it was kind of like an idealistic co-op set up by a lot of people who supported the ideas of Robert Owen, who is said to be the father of cooperation in the UK. So just thinking about some cooperative influencers, as they'd probably be called today. So just to give a kind of basic run through of some of the kind of thinkers who were around and who would have influenced the Rochdale Pioneers. So Robert Owen, I think many of you may have heard of Robert Owen. He's often called the father of cooperation in the UK. He was like a really sort of key social innovator. And, he had an experiment with, kind of social justice and delivering education and support to the workers in his mill. I mean, nevertheless, he still made his fortune, as part of the Industrial Revolution. But he turned his mind to kind of social good and creating like better outcomes for workers. And he was he also set up various experiments to create like a cooperative utopia. Unfortunately, none of them sort of worked in practice. But I think he was quite brave and, quite a sort of forward thinker at that time. I think one of the sort of people that often gets overlooked is William King, because rather than sort of thinking about cooperatives and sort of conceptualizing cooperatives, William King was very practical, and he kind of set out a sort of a rule book on, the kind of steps you need to take to set up a cooperative in practice. And he created a newspaper called The Co-operative, in which, he would, give examples of how to set up cooperatives and, how to make them work and what the different things that you need to do to set up a cooperative. And I think the people that set up, the Rochdale Pioneers, they were all readers of the Co-operative. And even, some of his kind of practical ideas were things like, don't meet in the pub. because, then you won't be drinking when you're having a meeting. So, just kind of really simple ideas like that. Like, don't be drunk when you're trying to set up a cooperative, I think is kind of a basic, yeah. And then we have Anna Wheeler. And I think, I like to sort of bring in a woman because, they often get overlooked as part of the kind of cooperative history. And she was a contemporary of Robert Owen. And one of the reasons why I think she was really important was because she spent quite a lot of time traveling in mainland Europe and talking about Owenite ideas in Europe, but also talking with other people in Europe and bringing their ideas back to the UK as well. So she was a really key figure in that kind of early stuff around cooperation. And then moving on to the Rochdale Pioneers. Now, if you want to learn a lot about the Rochdale Pioneers, there's some really good resources on the National Cooperative Heritage Trust website. So I won't go into too much detail here, but there's some kind of apocryphal stories about the Rochdale Pioneers that are quite interesting, like the idea that the Rochdale Pioneers brought all of their stuff over the moors, walked 10 miles in clogs, pushing a wheelbarrow to set up their shop. And nowadays, I think people probably think that they just brought their goods into Rochdale on the canal like anybody else would. But George Holyoake, who was also a key cooperator at that time, he was commissioned to write the history of the Rochdale Pioneers. And so he added some embellishments to make it a little bit more interesting. Like, he also invented a woman. He in the history of the Rochdale Pioneers, there's a fictional woman in there because there wasn't a woman at the outset of the Rochdale Pioneers. It was 28 men. So, it's important to remember that history is very subjective. But this picture, I think, is interesting because as cooperation got underway, people were really interested in it. And so they wanted to see what these cooperators looked like. So this is like 13 of the original pioneers. And this was taken, 20 years after they set up the cooperative. And I think it's quite interesting because it looks like it's just like a bunch of old blokes who've posed for this picture. But actually, they were all really quite young at the time. So, sort of thinking about that, they were actually really kind of young and quite brave to have set up the cooperative. So then looking then at their objectives, one of the things that I really like about their idea from the outset was this idea of setting up this self-supporting home colony of united interests. Now, I really like that phrase because it's that kind of idea of, reflecting on those cooperative values and principles. So being self-supporting, but also that home colony of united interests, and then assisting other societies in establishing such colonies. Now, I think this is what really sets the pioneers apart from other cooperative experiments, is that they, from the outset, they wanted this to spread. They weren't keeping it for themselves, and it wasn't, they wanted this to spread to other places. And it wasn't about them having it and then sort of, franchising it to other people. It was about genuinely sharing these ideas and their success with others. And to do this, they created Law First, which was kind of effectively the rule book of how to run a successful cooperative. And that's where we get the values and principles around cooperation. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in the second section. So, moving on from this, cooperatives struggled to develop because there was a lot of competition, and also because a lot of wholesalers didn't want to supply the cooperatives. So that's another thing about cooperators is, they'll be like, right, okay, well, if you're not going to help us, then we'll have to help ourselves. The idea of self-responsibility and self-help, again, coming into it. So they set up their own productive societies. So, you can see here, there's a whole range of different products that were created by cooperative productive societies. And, this is just like my opportunity to be able to look at some nice old-fashioned packaging that we don't have nowadays as well. But, you can, like anything you can think of was being produced. And just to sort of give an example, so around Manchester, there was all of this was going on. So, there was all of these different regions around Manchester. They were producing everything from kind of twine and flour, and they were printing. And, there's the biscuit factory at Crumpsall. And that's one of my favorite things in the archive is the catalogues for the biscuit factory, because the pictures in it are absolutely exquisite. And, just looking at lovely painted pictures of biscuits is quite a nice way to while away half an hour. And, so you can see, but also the cooperative movement had a stake in the Manchester Ship Canal as well. So they supported the development of the Manchester Ship Canal. So at this point, they were really, really expanding and really sort of like expanding their market, creating new cooperative societies and really, really strengthening as a movement. And then just kind of like expanding out for the kind of base of Greater Manchester, we can see here, this is all over the UK now. All of these sort of different examples of cooperative production. And, also encouraging cooperatives to buy from the Cooperative Wholesale Society, which was set up by the original co-operators as well. And it led to a lot of other cooperatives being created. And so then by the end of the 19th century, we have, the cooperative movement having grown from a small kind of isolated experiments right the way through to it being a pretty sort of national project, and all of that expansion. But then just to finish this section, just then looking at the kind of decline of the cooperative movement in the UK. So from the 1960s, a range of different factors came into play. So thinking about like deindustrialization and also like housing redevelopment. So a lot of that post-war reconstruction. So traditional communities being broken up, and the cooperatives would have been embedded in those communities. So there was a lot of changes, a lot of social changes, which then meant that a lot of the new towns and a lot of the new areas, or the sort of garden estates that were built in that post-war period, they often didn't have that cooperative infrastructure that went along with those communities. And also, increased competition, so cheap imported goods, and the end of price regulation as well, which meant that cooperatives could no longer compete with those economies of scale from larger suppliers. And that led to a lot of issues in the cooperative movement. So, sort of problematic mergers. So a lot of cooperative societies then had to kind of join together, and it just created a sort of very difficult infrastructure for cooperatives. And then, more recently, there's been some issues. I mean, particularly in the late 20th century, there was some quite problematic governance issues that came to the fore. And then around like the cooperative bank, which is now no longer a cooperative, but it's still called a cooperative bank. So, I think that is kind of where we're at with cooperatives. And, it's about kind of like thinking about like what next for cooperatives. So the first question is, what does the cooperative movement need to do? So how can the cooperative movement kind of recapture that sort of energy and expansion? Because looking at those slides and the way in which the cooperative movement kind of grew and developed and kind of had all of that kind of power and influence, because at one point, like self-service supermarkets in the UK, when they were new in the 1950s and 60s, the cooperative movement had a 90% share. Now it has about a 12% share of that. So, it's just like, a real contrast.
Talk out why cooperatives worked in the past, and yes, they were great. But if you look at now, what's going wrong and what needs to be better. So from that lens, we basically identified 3 areas where we feel that we can actually bracket all the need or the problems or solutions into is areas of needs, operations, and visibility. So if you actually, let's start from the visibility side. Sarah, our teammate, basically said that cooperatives, they're not flashy enough. They're not cool enough. And I think that brings out the issue of awareness, knowledge, that not people are aware of what cooperatives are. And even if they are, they're kind of like old hats, so old fashioned, yeah. So they're not cool enough for the new generation to be. They seem old fashioned, yeah. So that's probably the visibility side. So I think our group discussed ideas on how the visibility can be improved, and because this is what we see a lot of. If you see the Apple iPhone, right, next generation of the future, whatever, can we do the same for cooperatives and rebrand cooperatives as a whole? That's one end of it. I think the middle end is pretty straightforward, where obviously the reasons why cooperatives declined were because they were not able to match with the competitive needs of capitalism and scale. And that's a problem. So how do you tangibly solve that problem with scale and competition with current methods of production? So that's, I think, the central model. But on the one end, I think this is something that we were discussing is also interesting, is what is the need, right? So cooperatives came out of a very directive need of the hour at that time, which was production. People didn't have goods, they needed to produce. But is that a need right now? Oh, and what is the need for today? Like, I don't think the need anymore is we have enough goods, we don't need things to be produced. So cooperatives as production societies is what was the need of the 19th century. Mm-hmm. So to re-energize, I think we need to think of cooperative as what? What is the need? So do we?
And we will come on to that actually on the future section. So let's just take like one of the groups from this side. So who'd like to volunteer to give a bit of feedback from this side of the room? And then we'll come to different people to feedback on the other discussion topics. Brilliant.
One thing that we talked about was that the strength of a cooperative is in being hyper-local and solving local problems. And we kind of went on about that a lot because we were also talking about need and how everything you need right now is at your fingertips.
Yeah.
Or you can even get same day delivery at this point. And so what is the value offered by a shared holding? And so we were talking about, well, what are hyper local things that you can invest in? And so one thing we actually ended up talking about was, for instance, what about energy? Is there some way to almost have like a mini community grid of energy? And so, trying to think creatively about those things and what are needs that can only be met locally.
Okay, so we're just going to move on to the next section. So just to sort of quickly retouch then on the Rochdale pioneers. So looking at the difference between the pioneers and the other cooperative experiments that were happening at the time. So just kind of, we touched on this previously. So this is the famous bridge leading into Rochdale. It's not a very glamorous bridge, but it is, it does mark out Rochdale as the birthplace of cooperation. And here you can see the building is Toad Lane. So that's number 31 Toad Lane, which is now the Rochdale Pioneers Museum in Rochdale. And so looking at how did they go global? And we already touched on this. So looking at that, the reason was because they created this law first, but they also created the laws and objects which set out how to run a cooperative. And so, which brings us on to touching upon the modern values and principles. So the reason that they went global was because they created the Rochdale principles and the Rochdale values, which nowadays they've been revised at several points throughout history. So I think 1937, 1966, and 1995, the principles got a bit of a refresh to sort of reflect sort of current thinking. But the values have pretty much always stayed the same since the outset. And so then, looking at those principles that we're probably familiar with. So, we've already talked about, the sort of autonomy and independence. And we talked a lot about, self-help and self-responsibility, which underpin cooperatives. There used to be 6 principles, but in 1995, the creation of concern for community, because that used to be embedded within Principle 6, cooperation amongst cooperatives. So you can see they're also reflected in that cooperation amongst cooperatives, that idea that you're creating this cooperative infrastructure and, this kind of self-sustaining home colony. So you can still see those kind of original ideas of the pioneers coming through. And I mean, interestingly as well, with autonomy and independence, there's a bit of sort of conflict within the cooperative movement around the kind of political activities of cooperatives. Like, for example, in the UK, we have a cooperative party, which you can't be an MP in the cooperative party without also being a member of the Labour Party, but you can be a cooperative, like local councillor, for example. And some cooperators think that that's not in the spirit of the kind of apolitical nature of the original pioneers. But the main reason that the original pioneers had something around kind of political neutrality was mainly to stop people having any sort of factions and infighting within the cooperative. So, inevitably cooperatives had to kind of campaign politically, and in the UK, in order to get a voice within Parliament to influence policy, they had to create the cooperative party. So it's just kind of, it's kind of worth reflecting on these. So this is the reason why we have like a global cooperative movement, and why the pioneers are seen to be the creators of the global cooperative movement, because of these values and principles. And then the statement on the cooperative identity. So prior to 1995, there wasn't a kind of agreed common statement on the cooperative identity. So this was so basically the autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. So it's currently actually under revision as well, the statement on the cooperative identity, because thinking around 1937, 1966, and 1995, it's kind of due another visit. So there are people actually currently revisiting the statement on the cooperative identity and also the cooperative principles. So this is the reason why the cooperative movement is based on the Rochdale pioneers' kind of initial thinking around setting up cooperatives. So looking at the global movement today, this is the ICA membership, so the International Cooperative Alliance, which is the global apex body for cooperatives. So the organizations that will be members of the ICA will be the kind of apex organizations in individual countries. So, for example, there's 4 offices based around the world. So we have an office, the Americas is based in Costa Rica. The African office is based in Kenya. And in Asia Pacific, it's in India. And in Europe, it's in Belgium. And it's called Cooperatives Europe in Europe rather than the ICA. So the member organizations will be the apex organizations from each country. So, for example, in the UK, that would be Cooperatives UK. And just some sort of basic facts and figures around cooperatives. So, 12% of people on Earth are cooperators. And, the approximate measurement of the numbers of cooperatives is 3 million, and that works out to 1 billion cooperators worldwide. Now, I've been working at the college for 6 years, and these stats have never changed, or they've never updated them on their website. And I'd really like to be able to say that they'd have another look. And I think particularly post-pandemic, it would be really, really interesting to do like a comparison between the cooperative movement prior to the pandemic and the cooperative movement afterwards. And I think that would help us to kind of analyze and look at the way that cooperatives work and whether or not cooperatives are more resilient than other organizations as well. So I'd really like to see these stats being revisited and updated. But for now, that's what we have. And so interestingly as well, so, not just around sort of being a cooperative member, but also being an important employer around the world. So, 10% of the employed population around the world apparently employed in cooperatives. And just to kind of touch on what the cooperative sector looks like in the UK. So this is the most recent, this comes from the most recent report from Cooperatives UK. So, we have over 7,000 individual cooperatives in the UK, going from very, very sort of small, local cooperatives and sort of community-owned pubs and community-owned shops, all the way through to the Co-op, which is the Co-op with the blue logo. Which is the co-op which has its roots in the original Rochdale Pioneers cooperative. So, when you see a co-op with like a green sign, that's usually a different type of co-op. There's quite a few kind of very large independent co-ops in the UK as well. So, you've got kind of Central England and Mid-Counties Cooperative, as well as Southern Cooperative, as well as Scot Mid, which is a big cooperative society in Scotland as well. And, from this, you can see that the cooperative movement is actually growing. It contributes a significant amount to the UK economy as well, and employs, 250,000 people. But also thinking about, it isn't just a shop. I mean, the UK cooperative sector is dominated by consumer cooperatives, but there are a lot of cooperatives working in a range of different sectors. So everything from sort of housing and manufacturing and health and social care. I mean, I'd be quite interested to see what falls under this category of other. But just kind of interestingly, recently someone asked me, oh, I'm in this part of Liverpool for a day doing a course. Is there an interesting cooperative I could visit? And the cooperative I found for them was a cooperative laundrette. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because I've never found a cooperative laundrette before. And I was just saying, when I've looked at cooperatives in different countries to find an example, I found cooperatives. There's a cooperative in India where people collect snake venom to make antidotes. And there's a cooperative in Finland for inventors. So, it just goes to show you can have cooperatives, in any sector, and, doing anything you can do as a business can be done cooperatively. And so just to sort of look at some of the current issues that cooperatives are sort of dealing with, and also looking at, the reasons that cooperatives came about. We already talked about need, and, poverty has been a very sort of strong need that cooperatives has responded to throughout history. And so various different points. So, we're thinking around, the 1840s in the UK, all of the issues we've already discussed. But also 1860s in Germany with the agricultural depression. That's where you had a lot of sort of financial cooperatives created then, and the Raiffeisen movement is a really strong movement. And then, the depression in the US in the 1930s, but also in the 1970s in the UK or in mainland Europe as well, because of high unemployment. There was the creation of a lot of worker cooperatives as well. So throughout history, cooperatives have responded to poverty and need, but also looking at some other things that we talk a lot about in the cooperative sector. So cooperatives responding to various different sorts of inequalities. So looking at gender equality, but also looking at young people, and especially nowadays, high youth unemployment. So just looking at how cooperatives have responded, and also, people, sort of aging populations, and sort of access to social care for people as well. So, just giving some sort of cooperative evidence, there are apparently higher percentages of women on boards in leadership in cooperatives. And in the UK, it's said that 60% of people on boards in savings and credit cooperatives, for example, are women. And that compares to around 12% if you look at financial type of organizations in the mainstream sector. And also, the UK government recently showed that 50% of people in the sort of upper pay brackets in UK cooperatives, 50% of the people are women. So, it does sound as if cooperatives are actually, aiming to be more equitable, perhaps, than other types of organizations. But also what cooperatives can do is increase access to training and education, and that kind of strength in numbers as well. And, just generally improving people's working conditions by giving people a voice in how organizations are run. And then thinking about young people, young people can learn on the job. I mean, we talk about, cooperatives often as kind of schools for democracy, but also, thinking about things like housing co-ops, for example. People have got better access to accommodation, thinking about perhaps like student cooperative housing. There's quite a large housing co-op in Edinburgh, and people often talk about that being somewhere where they're not just they've not just got kind of secure accommodation, it's also about they learn a range of skills on the job. So they're learning how to run a housing co-op. They're learning, democratic processes. They're actually learning practical skills as well, because they're having to manage housing and managing a tenancy. So, it's kind of giving young people that opportunity as well. And then just thinking about, access to social care and for people with disabilities in the UK. I've come across a number of different co-ops where people have set up multi-stakeholder co-ops, where you've got kind of, carers and people in receipt of care who are kind of pooling resources or working together. So people are able to use their PIP payments, their kind of personal independence payments, and they can pool those together and then, have access to care. And just giving that people sort of more control over how they use services as well. And there's a really, really strong social care cooperative sector in Italy, which is really interesting. But that's because the Italian government has specific legislation to support that kind of activity. Unfortunately, we don't have that in the UK. So just a sort of few examples here. So for example, Van City in Canada has special products for people who find it difficult to access credit and savings from other sources. And it also has, like special rates on loans, and just basically gives people access to savings and credit who wouldn't normally have it. And they have like a what they call a fair and fast loan, so that people don't have to resort to like payday lending and that kind of thing. Equal Care Co-op was like what I was talking about earlier. That is one that was recently been set up quite near Manchester, and that's a multi-stakeholder cooperative. So like staff members are members. It enables people to kind of use an app. So it's online. So it's like a platform co-op effectively. So people are able to kind of ask for care for people to come in to support them to live in their own homes. But it means also that then the people who are working in that co-op are taking home more, a high percentage of that profit for their wages, rather than it being sort of creamed off by, the sort of platform provider. Cador is an example from Italy. So that is an example of a cooperative that provides access for people into employment. So that is actually a kind of tourism co-op. So it provides lots of opportunities for people to work in the tourism sector in a certain region, but it gives people who are ex-offenders and also people who have disabilities access to employment. And then the final one on this slide, WeGuild, is a cooperative network that was set up to support people who are self-employed. So when someone isn't able to work for some reason, because they've got because they're ill, people, the sort of collective input of all of the people within that network support that person while they're not able to work. So that's a kind of, it's just a whole group of people working in different sort of creative industries that are all chipping in to help each other out. And that's also set up as a co-op. So then looking at the future of work. So, people talk about the issues around, there's parallels between that industrialization and the changes in the sector. And then, looking at, digitization and the changes that people are facing now. So, everything is becoming automated, which means that many jobs are now redundant. However, people are always kind of talking about it as if it's a really negative thing. It also provides opportunities. So there are opportunities for people to develop digital work and skills as well. But, working cooperatively and being entrepreneurial are definitely the kind of skills that people will need to be able to sort of confront these issues around the future of work. And, people, there's lots of examples of how people are working together and creating platform co-ops to overcome the gig economy, for example. People fighting back against things like Uber. We've got examples of taxi cooperatives in Edinburgh and in different places in the world. But also like food delivery co-ops, for example, or courier co-ops. So rather than people using, I don't know what they would be in here. I don't think I've ever used one, but I can't think of one. Deliveroo, there we go. So, instead of Deliveroo, they're creating, it's called Cycle Co-op, and it's for cycle. Some people develop some software, and then they give that to other cooperatives to use, and they can set up very local, but it's like you were saying, it's that kind of local, and then having to compete in that market. But that does exist, and it's kind of open source software that people are sharing between themselves. Then, looking at climate action. So, the values and principles of cooperation are very closely aligned to the ideas around sustainable development. And in fact, in Principle 7, it actually talks about sustainable development and that concern for community. And, cooperatives have always thought about things like ethical sourcing and trading. And then driving societal change as well. So, for example, the co-op in the UK would talk a lot about how it was the first to introduce biodegradable plastic bags. It's one of the only organisations, that creates its own products and doesn't do any testing on animals. So there's lots of these kind of things that are trying to push behaviour change as well. And then, also talking about community-owned energy, land co-ops, so giving people access to land, so smallholders, and sustainable tourism. So just giving a few examples here, there's a coffee and chocolate cooperative, the Oro Verde, which is works with about 1,000 producers. But what it also does is it promotes sort of an agroforestry approach. So it's like introducing kind of native trees into the production as well. The Scottish Seas is a cooperative of Scottish fisher people who work together, and they also process the fish. So and they try to do it in a sustainable way, and keep that very local. And it's about wild fishing as well. So it's about creating livelihoods locally, but it's also about sustainably managing the fishing stocks. We've got Bay Wind Energy, which is one of the first energy cooperatives in England. And what they've done as well is they've created, a bit like the pioneers, they've created a kind of how-to kit, which they then pass on to other interested community cooperatives. And I mentioned a land cooperative. So this cooperative helps to provide people with access to small plots of land so that they can have a livelihood, create a livelihood from smallholder production. And then the final one there is a sustainable tourism co-op that mainly works with groups of young people, but provides a kind of cooperative alternative which is based on sort of sustainable practices. So it's a bit like it kind of runs things for thinking about like the Duke of Edinburgh type award, where you would get young people going on like outward bound type of things. So this is our second question. So what more do you think co-ops could be doing? So we've just touched really quickly on some issues there around kind of poverty and inequalities, and also climate change, and also the future of work, which are kind of the main modern type issues that cooperatives need to be confronting. So what more do you think cooperatives could be doing? So this is our second question.
The change that they were making, they were a part of it. When it comes to climate change, they're able to agree sort of solutions that will be more impactful to their local community. So I think when it comes to climate change, I definitely think that's an area that cooperatives can get involved in to have more deeper reach in the level of impact that they can.
And I think particularly around energy co-ops and the sort of current issues we have around energy, and some people saying, oh, just reopen the mines, that'll be okay. But that there's a real moment for cooperatives to step into that gap, I think, as well.
These issues are very political.
Yes.
Poverty, inequality. So I thought maybe cooperatives need to address their identity. There's identity crisis.
Yeah.
So because there's a history also of cooperatives being involved in colonization in Africa, and et cetera, et cetera. So it comes on. So I think, first of all, I want to know whether they're political or apolitical.
Yes.
If they're apolitical, then it would be very hard to go after these issues.
Well, I mean, I'm going to come on to that actually. So we'll come on to that on the next section. So is there someone who wants to just give us a quick sentence on this side of the room? There we are. Yeah.
Care homes and elderly people is going to be a real crisis in the next 30 years. Perhaps a cooperative model could do something to alleviate the extortion costs.
Yeah. Oh no, it's a really key area, and there has been some research done by the Cooperative Party and by the cooperative movement on cooperative social care, and it is, you know, the will to do it is there, but unfortunately, I mean, the sector is just very, very challenging, and I think, you know, people trying to run care homes, particularly, that's why I think, like, you know, when you have people kind of doing kind of care at home for people, it kind of works a bit better. But there are, like, for example, CASA is a cooperative in the UK, which does cooperative social care, and the people working there are the members. And it's about, you know, kind of like making it more sustainable and meaning that people can have a living wage and also have more of a relationship with the people, with the, you know, the cared for and the carers, having, you know, a stronger relationship. Thank you for that. I think I'm just going to have to move on because we're on 6:45, and I know that you all have had a, you know, you've probably had a really long day already. So I'm going to move on. So looking at cooperative futures. So I just think this is quite a nice quote, you know, thinking about the, you know, the giving, you know, falling into that lovely sort of analogy of the weavers working together. So, you know, they spun the threads that would help to stitch together a global movement. But I think, you know, and that idea that this movement has frayed with time, and we can all see that, and we know that because, you know, the cooperative movement does have a bit of an identity crisis. So thinking about now, every generation needs its pioneers. And, you know, looking again as well, you know, cooperatives tend to take hold when things are in flux. And if, you know, we're not in flux at the moment, and I don't know when we are, because it just feels pretty messy. And then thinking around, you know, that how cooperatives have often preceded kind of social innovation and change. So, you know, they're test runs for social contracts, which are now taken for granted. Like so many things that cooperatives did, and the reason that they were so radical was because they created you know, they did improve conditions for people, but now we take it for granted. So, for example, you know, thinking about the fact that cooperatives provided education and reading rooms, you know, and it led to the creation of like things like public libraries, you know, and education for people, and also, you know, people not having to kind of work, you know, for example, the biscuit factory that I talked about that I love, you know, that had, you know, it was the first factory in the UK that actually introduced like an 8-hour day. And, you know, there were other things that happened. It had like, you know, kind of social things going on and educational activities. So, you know, these are things that were then brought into like labor laws and that we take for granted. So, you know, we have to kind of, you know, make more of that, I think, as a movement. I went backwards instead of forwards. So then looking at resilience. So we often talk about cooperative resilience, and, you know, the fact that cooperatives are more resilient in times of crisis. Now, there is some evidence of this. So, for example, when, you know, post financial crisis in 2008, it was shown that cooperatives were less likely to close their doors than other sort of like-sized organizations. But also, in times of crisis, people often resort to, you know, financial type cooperatives because they seem to be a safer bet as well, and they're more risk averse. So there is that kind of, like we were talking about, a long game. So because they're more risk averse, it means that in times of plenty, cooperative type financial organizations, they might not make, you know, the kind of crazy profits that the private sector does, but also they kind of make better choices about what they do with their money, which means that actually when it comes to crisis, they have some backup, but they also have member assets to draw on. And then the cooperative economy report that was produced recently by Cooperatives UK showed that cooperatives especially new cooperatives, were better able to survive the COVID crisis than other similar type organizations that were set up and, at the same time. And I mean, it wasn't like massively more, but it was a good few percent more were able to survive. But also the fact that they were looking to the future and talking about expansion. And then, another issue that is really challenging, particularly in the UK, and I don't know the ins and outs of every sort of country around the world, but the UK business infrastructure for cooperatives is really bad. And in the UK, you can register as a cooperative using potentially 9 different legal forms and across a range of different regulators. So, for example, you could be a charity that's regulated by the Charity Commission. You can be a charitable company that's regulated by the Charity Commission and Companies House, or you can be a company that's registered with Companies House, or you can be a cooperative society that's regulated by the Financial Conduct Organization. So, it's messy. And also it's a lot harder to set up a co-op because you can't just take sort of some articles off a shelf and set up like you would a company. You have to kind of go through a process which costs people a lot more to set up, and that's when you go through the Financial Conduct Organization. And also Coops for Dev, which is part of Cooperatives Europe partnership with EU and the ICA, they carried out a global analysis of legal structures in many different countries, and you can find the information on the Coops for Dev website. It's really interesting to look at. And considering that the UK is supposed to be the home of the modern movement, it's actually got one of the worst records for supporting cooperatives. So, it was considered that their wording was that it was very cooperative unfriendly, which is kind of not where you want to be. And then raising finance for co-ops. I mean, a lot of these are kind of coming from the UK context, but, company law in the UK is designed for growth of capital and pursuit of profit. So it's difficult in the UK to access finance for setting up cooperatives. If you set up through the Financial Conduct Authority and you set up a cooperative society, then you can actually you can have community shares. So you can actually kind of do a share offer. But that's not possible if you don't, so if you register a different type of organization in the UK, you can't do that. So, it still means it's really problematic for people. And I mean, like any organization, cooperatives rely on a lot of sweat equity, but then that can create disparity within a cooperative, because then when you have new members who haven't invested that same level of sweat equity in the cooperative, it can create kind of sometimes a little bit of tension between different members. I've seen this in worker cooperatives where, the sort of founder members of a worker cooperative might be on a different wage than newer people. And then that can create a little bit of tension there. So, it's just worth thinking about. It's challenging to raise finance for cooperatives as well. And then we've already touched on the perception problems of cooperatives. If you mention cooperatives in the UK, people just think that you're talking about the co-op. When I was telling people about the fact I work for the Cooperative College, I think most of my family probably still think I work for the co-op. And I think they think that I actually go out training people how to use the tills and stack the shelves. I don't think they really have an idea about what I actually do. And then also there's this complaint that, the cooperative movement is really, really rubbish at communicating what it does well and how it is this innovative business type, and how, it comes from this grand heritage of being radical and quite cutting edge and, innovative about the way it works. And, it's just absolutely terrible at communicating that so that it makes a difference, that kind of ethical side of things and that social justice approach that it has. And then, so what the cooperative movement is currently doing is it is actually revisiting this cooperative identity, because it has recognized that, it is built on, there are many sort of like skeletons in the cupboard in the cooperative movement. So looking at how cooperatives have been used in the past. So they were used in the past by, colonial governments who, used cooperatives as a way of, extracting valuable resources, from other countries, but then that carried on. Then when, post-independence, a lot of countries, the government still carried on, using cooperatives, and often people didn't even know they were a member of a cooperative, and often people didn't have a choice about whether or not they were in a cooperative. They had to join the cooperative if they wanted to access resources and if they wanted to, sell their products. So it's about being honest about that, and it's about confronting that and sort of moving on from that. And then also recognizing this gap that exists between these enormous cooperatives like the Co-op, or any big Co-op, and small Co-ops, which are much more kind of conscious of the fact that they are delivering these kind of ethical and social justice types of activities in their work. And also that kind of membership, because in a big Co-op, people might not know that they're a member of a Co-op, whereas in a small Co-op, the membership is more likely to be a lot more engaged and also active in those sort of democratic practices. So the important questions that the Co-op movement is currently asking itself is around, is that cooperative identity adequately defined? Do people know what we mean? Is it widely understood? And I think we've talked about that tonight. I think we could say it's probably not widely enough. And also, are cooperatives operating in a manner that's consistent with it? Like, really confronting that. Like, are cooperatives actually living those values and principles? And it's about, being honest and being really reflective. I mean, I've seen a lot of cooperatives that you would barely tell the difference between the cooperative and just any other old business. Whereas there's other cooperatives that are like deeply engaged in really, really living the cooperative values and principles. And so then just looking at how co-ops are evolving. So one example of this is the fact that, the discussions that are going on around that deepening cooperative identity, they're looking at, diversity and inclusion, and, looking at how they can develop the principles further to include a specific principle around diversity and inclusion. But, like I mentioned earlier, there is this kind of about 30 years between each time the cooperative movement kind of looks at itself and goes, right, how can we make ourselves relevant to today? So it's not that there isn't a will there to do it, but just trying to take that kind of the diverse and kind of messy cooperative movement along with itself is the challenge. And one of the issues that the cooperative movement has is that, changing things like the statement on the cooperative identity, it's not just a matter for those cooperatives to decide it amongst themselves. I mean, some countries like Australia, I think, for example, has it within their, the legislation. So they'd have to actually change legislation on co-ops. So it's a big undertaking. So, that's why often these things take a long time and, kind of seem to be very slow moving. And so the final question here, well, we've already sort of talked about this really, about that kind of co-op difference and creating, something that's future-proof. So I think because we've got like a couple of minutes left, I just think it's probably better to just ask if anyone has any specific questions that has come up. Different cooperatives use different ways of making decisions. So you have and that can be like either collective or representative type organization. So for example, in a big consumer cooperative, and even between consumer cooperatives, you might have a different approach. So for example, you might have local area committees who vote people to sit on a national member council. So the big co-op has a national member council. So that will be representatives from all the different regions. So they'll have a regional committee. And they are elected from the membership. So they have to kind of campaign and produce, sort of a little blurb about themselves and say, vote for me. So, then members can vote. But then, how democratic is that? Because how many members know that they've got that vote and how many take the time? So, it's that's why that kind of question around, cooperatives having another look at and evolving in that way. But then you have other organizations. So for example, there's a food cooperative in Manchester called Unicorn Grocery, which is a worker cooperative. And they used to use consensus decision making, but they found it quite problematic. And I think sometimes, you have that, if you choose kind of voting, you have the potential of tyranny of the majority, and then then if you have consensus decision making, you've got the tyranny of the minority, where it might just be one person that refuses to sort of step in line with everybody else or come to a compromise. But then now they're experimenting with sociocracy. I don't know if you're aware of that. So that kind of circular decision making. So they're experimenting with that and bringing that into the way that they operate now. So there are cooperatives out there that are doing really kind of innovative things.